What is something shocking you found out about a friend or family member after they died? Same with my grandma. She was sent away to give birth to the baby at a home for teenage moms ran by nuns. She came home after had the baby and her parents never spoke of it again. She became a raging alcoholic. She's been sober 10 years now, but I'm convinced she started drinking to numb the pain of giving up a child and never speaking of it again. She's still alive and the family only found out about it right before we sent her to rehab. So crazy. I've always wanted to do an ancestry DNA test, but scared I might find the person and start some major shit in the family. Grinning face with sweat. LOL, my aunt, mom's sister, was married to a man who was one of 4 children. He was the only one who married. The 3 siblings lived together in a house up until each of them died. My uncle was the youngest. I just thought they decided marriage wasn't for them and lived their lives their way. I found out years after one of the aunts, Betty, passed away, that she had a 40-year-long affair with a married man. He wouldn't leave his wife and kids and Betty wouldn't leave the guy. 40 years. I can't even begin to imagine. The affair only ended when the guy passed away. She was truly in love with him and hoped he'd eventually leave his wife. The whole thing is actually pretty sad. Betty was a good woman and deserved better than that. That my great uncle had been physically abusive to his wife back in the olden days. Super cheery guy, used to tell me war stories at family reunions and was all laughs. Found out because as we lost him to dementia, the behavior came back with it and he couldn't be near my great aunt. They died having been apart from each other for months. Tragic thing. More of a funny one. One day, my grandpa thought he was having a heart attack. But being an old school hard ass, and a cop, he decided to sleep it off, hoping it would go away. He woke up the next morning, still having symptoms, and realizes yep, heart attack, so he decides to drive himself to the hospital. Showing up to the hospital, he decides that he doesn't want to pay those damn prices, so he drives down the street to find something cheaper and walks back to the ER. My great aunt and uncle never had kids, so they treated me and my siblings like their grandkids. My aunt died 10 years ago this year. So I was looking up her grave site so I can visit and saw a suggested link to a page about the grave of her child. I was very confused because I always just assumed they didn't want kids. Turns out they had a son who only lived to be a few months old. Made me sad to think that they did want kids and either couldn't or wouldn't after their son died. Not me, but my uncle found out he had a different dad than his siblings when he was taking a DNA ancestry test. His mother had had an affair. Both parents were dead when he found out. He's a huge prick, so I thought it was funny how it hit him. He mistreated my mother for not being one of their full siblings from the same parents, and turns out he isn't either. LOL. We had this friend of the family that was always presented to us as our Uncle Alan. He was my dad's English teacher in high school. Anyways, long story short, on his deathbed, he confessed to my mum that he used to fuck my dad in high school and that my dad had been blackmailing him his entire life. My dad is a total piece of shit, by the way. I have not spoke to him in over a decade. But yeah, this was a pretty fucked up revelation, even for him. After my grandma died, we found a letter from an unnamed woman to my grandfather. It was a letter claiming that my grandfather was the father of her child. That if he wasn't going to leave my grandmother for her, she would abandon the baby with them and would have no part in raising it. With the death of my grandma, no one else alive in my family had any idea what this letter really meant. Basically, anyone who could give any clarification was already dead. Did my dad have another sibling? Was my uncle secretly not my grandma's biological child? Was she lying and there was no child? We will never know. 4 years ago my dad passed away in an accident. It totally broke my mom and siblings. He and I never really got along, so I was sad but didn't take it nearly as hard as my family. A year after he passed, my mom gave me his old desktop when my computer died. I found out that he'd been cheating on my mom for years when I stumbled onto the folder where he saved every chat log, picture, video, etc. Most of them were only online, but he met up with one woman while he was out of town for work. I've never told my family and don't think I ever will. It was the day before, but still. My grandfather had a cache of things from the war that he never clearly explained the origins of. Letters, Nazi patches, swastikas, and other items. He finally admitted that he had come by them in the Netherlands after he and a friend shot a prisoner and raided his body. He kept the items. Rather prosaically, he said he felt no remorse for the bloody Jerrys and would die with a clear conscience. My grandfather had been in the British Army as of 1938 and been to Dieppe, Normandy, and later liberated one of the most notorious Nazi camps. Till the day he died, he had extreme disdain for the Germans whom he claimed had ruined his life. COVID-related pneumonia. He apparently started feeling worse, but refused to let A take him to the hospital or call for an ambulance. He ended up passing away overnight. He was a very stubborn individual, so I am not surprised by this, unfortunately. It honestly shocked us all to know someone personally this young pass away. Went to a friend, R, from college's funeral about a month ago. He passed young, early 30s, and had a wife and 3 small kids, with the youngest 2 being twins born early this year. We were close in school but only casually kept touch over the years, so I had only met his wife, A, a few times. I get to the funeral and was surprised how well she seemed to be holding it together, but figured everyone handles grief differently. I offer my condolences and then end up chatting with a few other college friends after the service. A comes up to the group to let us know that we are invited to go have a drink with her and a few others if we want, as her parents are watching her girls for her. I was going to decline until she states she really wants all of us to join because she needs to let us all know what she found out over the last week while going through ours things to try and get her and the girls' life organized. Apparently the reason she wasn't very upset was because R had been leading a double life for the past 13+ years. He had always claimed his dad had owned a trucking company and then sold it, leaving him really well off. Based on his spending habits, this all seemed true. He also had claimed his mom passed while we were in school, that he was an only child. After he left the college I attended during our sophomore year, he would post pictures of Vanderbilt and claimed he transferred there to finish school. He also said he got a master's from a different prestigious school. I had worked with him briefly a few years ago in a professional capacity when his company reached out to possibly work with my company, so based on his role there, All of that totally sounded like it could be true. Turns out none of it was. His mom and sister attended the funeral. The mom all of us, including his wife, thought had died when we were in college, and the sister none of us knew existed. She had no idea he told people she was dead. She thought R and A eloped, and with her living out of state, R would make up excused why A didn't visit when he did. R had also told us his sister was his cousin, so we were all shocked by that too. R even went so far as to show A an obituary of his dead mom when they were dating. A thought the whole time that his actual mom was his aunt and that his sister was his cousin. The school stuff was also all BS. He apparently transferred to an online school and got a bachelor's, but would send us pictures from Vanderbilt's campus. The trucking company his dad owned was real, but actually went bankrupt and was liquidated. The trust fund he told A that he set up for the girls doesn't exist. He had told A he didn't have students' loans but actually had $78,000 still. He had maxed out multiple credit cards she didn't know existed, and on top of all of this, he was cheating on A with multiple other women. Taking them for fancy dinners, to the casino, getting hotel rooms for them. Needless to say, A was livid, and she was very happy to find out she wasn't the only one R had been lying to all these years. The whole thing seriously felt like a movie. I didn't realize stories like this actually happened in real life. I am still sad my friend passed, as he seemed like a friendly good guy in the time I knew him, but I also realize many of us never met the real him. Now the rest of us are doing what we can to help A and his girls. Great-grandma lived in a boarding house while great-grandpa was a traveling salesman. There was a nicely dressed man who would come through on business like clockwork. He thought 4-year-old grandma was adorable and would watch her for great-grandma if she needed to run to the store. He suddenly stopped coming around, and a few weeks later great-grandma saw his picture in the paper. Turns out, she had been letting pretty boy Floyd babysit her kid. Ancestry DNA is how I found out my grandfather had an affair. It showed I had a half-uncle the next state over. Got to meet him nevertheless, along with a few other relatives that were curious to meet him. He was shy, but a nice dude. The majority of the family are not aware of his existence, and the few that we did tell that didn't meet him were not happy that we were talking to him, and both want us to stop talking to him and forget he existed. My grandpa had 10 kids, 5 with my grandma, and 5 with little grandma. He didn't divorce my grandma. He just had 2 wives. From what I hear, during World War II he couldn't get back to Hong Kong after the Japanese invaded, so he met some woman wherever he was, then decided she'd be his concubine or whatever. One aunt is mentally unstable and was never told. One aunt is being very dramatic about it. The remaining aunt and uncle just decided that there's nothing to be done and nothing changes. My grandpa was their dad no matter what, even if he's not bio. The other guy was just a stranger. Grandma messed up, but she was a loving mom. My mom felt something was hinky since she was a teenager, so she wasn't surprised. She always insisted grandma had a darker side. Her brother that actually was my grandpa's kid too, well, I don't know how he felt about it. He's since passed. We've actually made a lot of jokes about it, though. If you don't laugh, you cry. My grandma and grandpa had 6 kids. Turns out, only my mom and one uncle belonged to grandpa. Grandma was having a long-term affair with some guy for years. No wonder Grandma was nervous all the time. She certainly carried a guilty burden. Ancestry DNA, blowing people's minds daily. Another thing, she admitted nearly 20 years later, on her deathbed, she didn't die this time around but thought that that my uncle, the toddler, was the result of an affair with her boss. As for my dad's father, when my dad was in his early 20s, he was working as a waiter a couple of towns over from where he had grown up, when his father walked in with his new family. He said he took their order, brought him their food, they paid the bill and left. He knew without a doubt it was his father. But he never acknowledged him, like he either didn't recognize him or he really just didn't want to. He thought he had called out to him at one point, but he was talking to his new son, who had the same name. My father is a JR and so was the new kid. He had just completely started over. I found this all out when I asked my father about the history of mental illness in our family when I was diagnosed bipolar last year. He said we had none, but my aunt said, "Don't you remember when Mom went away?" My dad and aunts didn't know what had happened exactly. My oldest aunt, let's call her Mary, she would have been 12 or so then, remembers the most and said it started when Grandma had come home from work when they were making berry smoothies in a blender and Grandma was convinced that it was my toddler uncle's brains in the blender, despite him sitting there in the kitchen with them, alive and well. She started screaming at them about how evil they were and shaking him and trying to get him to wake up even though he was crying and screaming. At some point she grabbed a knife and was chasing them with it. Mary somehow got all the little ones and went to a neighbor's a ways down the road, middle of the country, until their dad came home. Mary met him at the driveway and explained what happened and he told her to stay at the neighbor's until he came back. They were there a few days when someone from the state came and got them. My dad and the two older girls were put in foster care and the two younger ones went to some family. Almost a year went by and then, one day, they were all brought back together and given back to Grandma, who they hadn't heard from the entire time, but their dad was just gone. Turns out after he put her away, he just moved away and left them all. She refused to talk about what happened and they all eventually found out through another family member. Your Uncle Jack literally did the one job that nobody wanted, but we all needed. Fuck that terrifying job. Had a friend who was a Navy SEAL for 11 plus years. He never talked about any of it. He had a very mysterious injury from serving where his left arm became more paralyzed over time. Anytime you brought it up, he would just go silent for 3 or 4 days. They probably did us favors not telling us. My Uncle Jack was a quiet, mild-mannered man, with a good sense of humor. He looked like a slightly shorter, slightly slimmer Burl Ives. He was a successful psychiatrist, highly respected in his field. Turns out he was also an OSS agent during WW2. He never told anyone anything about what he did in the war. His 2 sons, an attorney and an Army Ranger, both asked him about it and he wouldn't tell them a word. My mom didn't want me after I was born. She tried to give me away to my aunt, the only person she trusted with me. My grandfather told me that, the night after her funeral that morning. My aunt confirmed a few days later.